The Royal Guards of Buckingham Palace are an iconic symbol of discipline and tradition. Known for their unwavering stoicism, these guards stand tall, immovable, and unflinching, even as throngs of tourists snap photos, crack jokes, and occasionally try to provoke a reaction. Their silence and precision are as much a part of their identity as the towering bearskin hats and scarlet tunics they wear. Yet, beneath the polished exterior lies a human connection to the very traditions they protect, one that, on rare occasions, breaks through the facade. For George Walker, an 85-year-old World War II veteran, visiting Buckingham Palace was the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. Having served in one of history's most defining conflicts, George had spent much of his life far from such grandeur. Now, retired in a quiet English village, George's days were filled with gardening, storytelling, and memories of a past that still lived vividly in his mind. When his grandchildren surprised him with a trip to London to see the changing of the guard, George packed his medals, his polished shoes, and his cane, eager to witness the pageantry. On a brisk autumn morning, George stood near the palace gates, his chest adorned with medals that gleamed in the sunlight. The bustling crowd jostled for the best view, cameras raised high as the guards performed their precisely choreographed march. George, however, seemed less focused on the spectacle and more on the guards themselves. Their measured steps, crisp salutes, and unyielding presence reminded him of his younger days, when discipline and duty defined his world. As the ceremony unfolded, something unexpected happened. One of the guards, passing by in the procession, glanced in George's direction. For a brief moment, the guard's stoic expression softened, and he offered George a subtle nod, a gesture almost imperceptible to the crowd, but deeply meaningful to the veteran. George froze, unsure if he had imagined it, but the murmurs from nearby spectators confirmed the moment. "Did you see that?" someone whispered. "He nodded at the man with the medals." George's eyes welled up with tears. In that small, silent gesture, the guard had acknowledged his service, his sacrifices, and the invisible weight he carried. It was a moment of profound respect, a break in protocol that resonated far beyond the gilded gates of Buckingham Palace. Unbeknownst to George, this was just the beginning of a series of heartwarming moments that would leave him, and everyone around him, forever changed. George Walker remained rooted in place, the guard's subtle nod replaying in his mind. He adjusted his cane, his fingers brushing the cool metal of his medals. The bustling crowd around him faded as his thoughts wandered back to his days in uniform, standing at attention, saluting superiors, and bearing the weight of duty and sacrifice. The nod had felt like a bridge across time, a silent acknowledgement of the bond shared by those who had served. The crowd takes notice. "Did you see that?" a woman nearby said, her voice tinged with excitement. He nodded at the man with the medals. Others turned to look at George, their faces softening with recognition. Some smiled, while a few offered respectful nods of their own. A young boy tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad, is he a soldier?" "Yes, son," the father replied, his voice hushed. "He's a veteran. That's why he's wearing those medals." George shifted uncomfortably under the sudden attention. He wasn't used to being the focus of admiration. For decades, his service had been a quiet part of his life, something he reflected on in solitude. Now, surrounded by strangers who seemed to share in his pride, he felt both honored and overwhelmed. A guard's quiet acknowledgement. As the changing of the guard ceremony continued, George kept his eyes on the soldiers. Their movements were flawless, each step perfectly aligned, each salute crisp and deliberate. He admired their discipline, feeling a pang of nostalgia for the days when he'd been just as sharp. Toward the end of the ceremony, another unexpected moment occurred. A different guard, positioned closer to George, subtly broke protocol. After exchanging salutes with his commanding officer, he turned his head ever so slightly and met George's gaze. This time, the gesture was even clearer. A deliberate glance, a nod, and a fleeting smile before resuming his stoic stance. The crowd erupted in quiet murmurs again, a ripple of emotion spreading through the onlookers. George's chest swelled, his hand tightening on his cane as he nodded back, the gesture a silent exchange of respect. A young boy's question. After the ceremony concluded, the crowd began to disperse, but a young boy, no more than 10 years old, lingered nearby with his parents. His wide eyes were fixed on George, his curiosity evident. "Excuse me, sir," the boy said timidly, stepping closer. "Were you a soldier?" George smiled warmly, leaning slightly on his cane. "I was, lad, a long time ago." The boy's father stepped forward, offering a handshake. "Thank you for your service," he said earnestly. "It's an honor to meet someone who served in World War II." George nodded, his voice humble. "I did what needed to be done, just like those young men out there today." The boy's mother encouraged him. "Go on, ask your question." The boy hesitated, then blurted out, "Were you scared?" George chuckled softly. "Sometimes, yes," he admitted. "But bravery isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what you must, even when you are." The boy's face lit up with understanding, and George felt a deep sense of fulfillment. It wasn't often that he had the chance to share his experiences, and seeing the boy's fascination reminded him of the importance of passing down these stories. Other veterans honored. As George moved away from the gates, he noticed a small gathering of veterans near a bench, their own medals gleaming in the sunlight. They had clearly come for the ceremony as well, their weathered faces betraying lifetimes of service and sacrifice. George made his way toward them, his cane tapping lightly against the pavement. The veterans greeted him warmly, their shared experiences dissolving the need for formal introductions. Together, they began swapping stories, their laughter and solemn nods punctuating the conversation. It wasn't long before one of the Royal Guards approached them, a young soldier whose sharp uniform and disciplined stride contrasted with the warmth in his eyes. "Gentlemen," the guard said quietly, his voice respectful, "on behalf of all of us, thank you for your service." The veterans, George included, were taken aback. The gesture was simple, yet profound. The guard then did something unexpected. He removed his bearskin hat and held it at his side, an act of informal respect rarely seen. A shared bond. As George sat with the other veterans, he noticed that the younger visitors seemed drawn to their group. Parents encouraged their children to shake hands with the veterans, and questions about their medals and experiences began to flow. George found himself answering questions about his time in the war, recounting tales of camaraderie, loss, and resilience. One moment stood out. A young girl approached, shyly holding a small notebook. "Can I draw your medals?" she asked. George chuckled, touched by the innocent request. "Of course, dear. They're yours to draw." As the girl sketched, George explained the significance of each medal, her wide eyes soaking in every word. He felt a profound sense of connection, as though the stories of his past were being carried forward to a new generation. The guard's perspective. Later, Rachel, a journalist covering the ceremony, approached George. She had noticed the gestures of the guards and was curious about their significance. "It's rare to see them break protocol like that," she said. "Why do you think they did it?" George thought for a moment, his gaze drifting back to the guards standing at attention. "Because they understand," he said softly. "Even if they've never been in combat, they know the weight of service. It's something you carry with you, no matter where or when you served." Rachel nodded, jotting down his words. "I think people will find this inspiring," she said. "It's not often we see such humanity in the midst of ceremony." A moment of reflection. As the day drew to a close, George found himself back near the gates of Buckingham Palace. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the historic structure. The guards had changed shifts, but their presence remained a testament to the enduring traditions of service and honor. George leaned on his cane, his heart full from the day's events. He had come to Buckingham Palace expecting to admire the pageantry and precision of the royal guards. What he hadn't anticipated was the profound respect and connection he would feel, both from the guards and from the strangers who had taken the time to honor his service. For George, it was more than just a visit to London. It was a reminder that the sacrifices of veterans are never forgotten, even in the most unexpected ways. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, George Walker lingered near the gates of Buckingham Palace, soaking in the quiet after a day filled with moments he would never forget. The stoic guards, who had initially seemed so distant and unapproachable, had shown him a level of respect that touched his very soul. For the first time in years, George felt not only seen, but deeply valued, his service woven into the fabric of the day's events. The earlier gestures from the guards replayed in his mind: the subtle nod, the deliberate glance, the unexpected approach to honor him and the other veterans. These small acts carried immense meaning, breaking through the rigid formality of their role to acknowledge a shared bond of service. For George, they weren't just acknowledgments of his medals or his uniform. They were acknowledgments of his sacrifices, the comrades he had lost, and the weight he had carried long after the war ended. An emotional farewell. As George turned to leave, another guard emerged from the palace gates, this one younger, his face marked with the seriousness of duty, but also a quiet warmth. Without hesitation, the guard approached George and offered a sharp salute. The crowd, sensing the significance of the moment, fell silent. George, his hand trembling slightly, returned the salute with the crispness of a soldier who hadn't forgotten the meaning behind the gesture. "Thank you for your service, sir," the guard said quietly, his voice steady. George nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "And thank you for yours," he replied. The crowd, which had grown to include onlookers of all ages, erupted into soft applause, the sound carrying through the open square like a ripple of gratitude. George smiled, a rare but genuine expression, as he turned back toward the street. A lasting impact. The trip to Buckingham Palace had been a gift from his grandchildren, but the true gift had been the connection he felt, not only with the guards, but with the people who stopped to listen to his stories, who took the time to honor him and his fellow veterans. It was a reminder that while wars may end, the respect for those who fight them endures. Later that evening, George sat in his small hotel room, a photograph in hand. The picture captured the moment he stood among the guards, their disciplined stance softened by their humanity. He traced the edges of the photo, his heart full of pride and gratitude. For George, the day had been more than a visit to a royal landmark. It had been a powerful affirmation that service and sacrifice transcend time, uniting generations in shared respect and unwavering honor. As he prepared for bed, George whispered to himself, "They still remember us." And with that thought, he drifted into a peaceful sleep. Oh,